Today, I will be discussing some ethical dilemmas in social work practice that you might experience and how to address these ethical dilemmas. The first thing that I want to discuss is some terminology. When I say an ethical dilemma, I'm discussing a situation in which there's conflict between two different ethical principles. This is rather different from what is a rather unethical or illegal behavior. So in some situations, there is very clear guidance from either an ethical principle or a law, and that guidance was not followed. That's unethical. An ethical dilemma is where there's not clear guidance and there's really a conflict between two principles and you're not sure how to proceed. And there's really two paths that you ethically and legally could take. When we think about unethical or illegal behavior, this might be not reporting child abuse if you're a mandated reporter, which you're mandated to do by law. So the law takes precedence. If you don't complete required client visits, so it might be that your agency requires you to see clients on a monthly basis and you don't complete the visits, but you say that you do, that's just unethical and illegal. If you have a relationship with a former or current client, that is unethical. If you employ a client, a previous or current client, that would also be unethical. It's not an ethical dilemma, it's just unethical. And if you improperly document client sessions, so if you have to have certain client notes for the sessions that you do, or you say you met with a client when you actually didn't, that would be unethical. Not an ethical dilemma, it's just unethical. And some of these are just illegal at the same time. So what happens if you engage in unethical behavior? It might be that you get in trouble with the law. For example, if you don't report child abuse, a situation you're aware of and you're mandated to report it, this is a Class B misdemeanor in the state of Kansas, and in many other states, it's either a misdemeanor or a felony. Your social work license could be suspended by BSRB. BSRB is the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board for the state of Kansas. So it might be that if you're a licensed social worker, you could lose your license in the state of Kansas or receive other disciplinary actions. For example, you could be put on probation and required to meet with the supervisor on a more regular basis. You also could be fired from your job. So it all depends on the level of the unethical behavior and what if you broke your agency policies or the law in the state that you're practicing. But when it comes to ethical dilemmas, that has to do with unethical behavior. So very clear guidance. But when it comes to ethical behavior and how you should proceed, you can receive guidance from different sources. The first is the NASW Code of Ethics. So as a social worker, you must adhere to the NASW Code of Ethics, which you can find online. And there are very specific ethical guidelines that are stipulated that all social workers must follow. There's also laws set by individual states. For our purposes, we'll discuss the state of Kansas since that's where most of us will be practicing. And it's important to be aware of very specific Kansas state laws with regards to working with clients that have been established for mental health professionals in the state of Kansas. And it's important to be aware that your ethical conduct, again, is governed by the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. So if you want to become a licensed social worker in the state of Kansas, you receive your license from the BSRB. They also have the power to take licenses away if you would engage in some unethical behavior. And Kansas state law has very certain stipulations in place for working with clients. There's also US federal law. There's policies at your individual agency. So each individual agency has policies that you need to be adhering to, and your ethical behavior is also stipulated by your moral or religious beliefs. So when we think about ethical dilemmas, it might be that there's a conflict between any of these different levels of ethical behavior. So it might be that an agency policy is conflicting with your religious beliefs, or a Kansas state law is conflicting with your agency policy, or vice versa. So there can be various conflicts here that are preventing you from having a clear guidance on how to proceed. There's also situations where multiple principles within the NASW Code of Ethics are conflicting. And that's when we really have to consider which one is most important for the client's safety and well-being. When we think about ethical dilemmas that you might experience in your practicum setting, there's a few to be aware of, although this is certainly not a comprehensive list. The first is thinking about dual relationships. So it might be that if you are working in your practicum that you run into someone that you know from outside of practicum, you know someone from your personal life. Or it might be that you are at a practicum and had previously worked in a social service setting and some clients who have been clients at both settings, and you have a dual relationship there because you know them from multiple settings. There also might be some confidentiality issues. So if you are working with a client and you need to share the information with another service provider, and you do or do not have permission of the client to do that. There's also self-determination. So helping clients be the ones to make those decisions on their own. And do we allow clients self-determination in all situations, or are there some limits on that? And finally, competence. So you have to work within your area of competency. And it might be that you are put in a situation where you don't feel competent to proceed, that you just don't have the necessary education or training to proceed in that way. So again, these are just a few ethical dilemmas you might experience in practicum. And we're going to talk through some specific steps to take on how you're going to address these dilemmas. When you're thinking through them, the most important thing is to think about what are the two issues involved. What is the dilemma here? I can make this decision or I can make decision B. Here's decision A, here's decision B. What are the relevant ethical codes or the law that adhere to these different situations? Why would you choose A or why would you choose B? What does the NASW Code of Ethics say? What does the Kansas law say, etc., about these different decisions? Then, what are your probable courses of action based on those ethical guidelines? And most importantly is to seek supervision. You are not alone in this situation. You should be discussing your options with coworkers, your supervisor, or your field liaison, your faculty member who is helping you. But most important, again, is to remember that you shouldn't be making these decisions on your own, regardless of whether you're a practicum student or a practicing social worker. Have someone else assist you. Have someone who's not an outsider, but someone who's not directly involved in the situation, still a social worker at your agency, who's able to look in and say, yeah, this is the direction we need to take. So what's important to remember is that when we think about the NAS Code of Ethics, there's going to be situations in which multiple code of ethics are going to apply, and they're going to tell you to take different directions. So in those situations, we're going to use what's called the ethical principle screen. This is a pyramid, and the protection of life is at the top, and privacy, confidentiality is going to be below that, along with other factors. So when we have a conflict between multiple ethical principles with regards to the NAS Code of Ethics, we should be taking the step based on the higher principle. So protection of life is always at the top. So anytime there's a concern of a client of loss of life, or whether that be the client is going to hurt themselves or someone else, that's always going to take precedence over any other ethical principles. So as an example, when we think about involuntary commitment, so let's say we have a client who tells us that they're thinking about hurting themselves and they have strong suicidal ideation, they have a plan of action, and we are very concerned that in the near future, the client is going to hurt themselves. That's a situation where we have to consider involuntary commitment. We might discuss with the client that they should commit themselves to a hospital. And if the client says no, then that has to do with self-determination. That's their choice to do that. They also have privacy. There's also privacy and confidentiality. So the decision to breach confidentiality, if a client tells you in confidence that they are going to harm themselves, then you, by telling someone else and involuntarily committing them to the hospital, you would be breaching that confidentiality. So it would really hurt the rapport that you've built with the client. On the other hand is the protection of life. So the NASW Code of Ethics, I have a quote here: social workers may limit clients' right to self-determination when potential actions pose a serious, foreseeable, and imminent risk to themselves or others. So again, privacy, confidentiality is in the NASW Code of Ethics, protection of life also in the NASW Code of Ethics. These are two principles, core social work principles that are conflicting in this situation when it comes to involuntary commitment. So in this situation, we have to pull out our ethical principle screen and realize that protection of life, again, is at the very top. So the rapport we would lose from the client from breaking their confidentiality would be below ensuring that they are maintaining their well-being and that we are protecting their life. So in this situation, involuntary commitment, if we are immediately concerned about the client hurting themselves, would take precedence in any situation. So again, when we think about ethical dilemmas, it's always important to think about what are the conflicting guidelines here and which one needs to take precedence based on this ethical principle screen. And finally, most importantly, always get supervision. Seek supervision from a trusted colleague or a supervisor if at all possible.